the moral pathology of everyday life. It is well known that the notion of the pathological has the status in Kant's practical philosophy of a kind of a conceptual knot, linking numerous divergent theoretical strands. Kant uses this term to designate that which does not belong to the order of the ethical. We should stress, however, that this notion of the pathological must not be considered the opposite of the normal. On the contrary, in Kant's view, it is our normal, everyday actions that are more or less always pathological. We act pathologically when there is something driving our actions, serving either to propel us forward or to impel us from behind. For this compelling force, Kant uses the general term triebfeder, drive, or incentive. Anything whatsoever can serve as such a compelling force, from the most basic need to the most elevated and abstract idea. The extension of this concept is the world of normality as such. Hence the alternative to the pathological cannot be the normal, but will rather involve such concepts as freedom, autonomy, and the formal determination of the will. Ethics itself, as Kant was well aware, also requires a driving force, which he introduces in a quite macabre passage in the Critique of Practical Reason. Quote, "A respect for something entirely different from life, in comparison and contrast to which life and its enjoyment have absolutely no worth. Man lives only because it is his duty, not because he has the least taste for living. Such is the nature of the genuine drive, echte triebfeder, of pure practical reason." End of quote. It must be emphasized, however, that Kantian ethics will not simply be an ethics of asceticism, of the renunciation of all pleasure on principle. We should not let the passage above lead us to conclude that the ethical subject will not be permitted to demand for herself any comfort or good. The real paradox lies elsewhere, in a structurally determined missed encounter between the pleasure principle and the dimension of the ethical. It is not that pleasure is forbidden to the ethical subject, but rather that it loses its attractive power for such a subject. It is available and accessible, just no longer desirable. Furthermore, we may even find a note of encouragement in this seemingly gloomy idea. We need have no fear that entry into the realm of the ethical will require us to sacrifice all the pleasure we hold so dear, since this will not even be experienced as a loss or sacrifice. We will not be the same person as before. We will have nothing to regret. Such a missed encounter between the pleasure principle and the ethical closely resembles the missed encounter definitive of love, so pointedly described in Marcel Proust's Swan in Love. Here the hero is desperately in love with Odette, who no longer loves him. In his terrible suffering, he at first believes that what he really wants is to cease to be in love with her, so as to escape from his suffering. But then, upon more careful analysis of his feelings, he realizes that this is not so. Instead, he wants his suffering to end while he himself remains in love, because his experience of the pleasure of love depends on this latter condition. The problem is that although he knows that his suffering would end if he were to cease being in love with Odette, if he were to be cured of his love for her, this is what he least wants to happen, since in the depths of his morbid condition he feared death itself no more than such a recovery, which would in fact amount to the death of all that he now was. In other words, cured of his condition, he would no longer be the same subject, so he would no longer find either pleasure in Odette's love or pain in her indifference and infidelity. This situation, described by Proust, allows us to define more clearly the relationship between the Kantian notions of the pathological and the ethical. The subject is attached and subjected to her pathology in a way that is not without ambiguity. For what the subject feels most is not the loss of this or that particular pleasure, but the loss of the very frame within which pleasure or pain can be experienced as such at all. The subject fears losing her pathology, the pathos which constitutes the kernel of her being and current existence, however miserable it may be. She fears finding herself in an entirely new landscape, a featureless territory, in which her existence will no longer be confirmed by what she feels. Kant's point is that this fear is groundless, since it belongs to the very subject who will no longer be around, should the transition to the ethical take place, to experience this loss as a loss. A second crucial concept to introduce here from the vocabulary of practical reason is that of the object of the faculty of desire, Objekt des Begehrungsvermögens. For if the will is determined by such an object, which is external to duty itself, our conduct will never be anything other than pathological. Now, the faculty of desire serves as the foundation of our actions. It is one of the essential characteristics of human life. Quote, "Life is the faculty of a being by which it acts according to the laws of the faculty of desire. The faculty of desire is the faculty such a being has of causing, through its representations, Vorstellungen, the reality of the objects of these representations. Pleasure is the representation of the agreement of an object or an action with the subjective conditions of life, i.e., with the faculty through which a representation causes the reality of its object." End of quote. In Kant's time, and before Kant as well, it was commonplace to distinguish between a lower and a higher faculty of desire. Kant himself strongly opposes this distinction. He finds it astonishing that otherwise perspicacious writers have believed that it is possible to pinpoint the difference between a lower and a higher faculty of desire by noting whether each representation associated with pleasure originates either in the senses or in the understanding. However dissimilar the representations of the object, be they characteristic of the understanding or even reason instead of the senses, the feeling of pleasure, by virtue of which they constitute the determining ground of the will, is always similar in character. Feelings of pleasure are always empirical and, consequently, pathological. A pleasure may very well be an intellectual pleasure, but this does not make it any less a pleasure. A fortiori, pleasure need not be immediate. It can instead require effort, delay, and sacrifice. It happens, for instance, says Kant, that a person can find satisfaction in the mere exercise of power, in the consciousness of spiritual strength in overcoming the obstacles in the way of his designs, or in the cultivation of intellectual talents. We may be correct to consider this among the more refined of our joys and delights, but this is no reason to claim that such pleasures determine the will in any way that is different from that of sensual pleasures. At this point in his arguments, Kant remarks, in a way that confirms, despite his reputation, that he had a sense of humor, that to assume this difference between the lower and the higher faculty of desire resembles the error of ignorant persons who wish to dabble in metaphysics and who imagine matter as so subtle, so super subtle, that they almost get dizzy considering it, and then believe that they have conceived of a spiritual but still extended being. In other words, one cannot attain the realm of the ethical by means of a gradual elevation of the will. by pursuing more and more refined, subtle, and noble goals, by gradually turning away from one's base animal instincts. Instead, we find that a sharp break, a paradigm shift, is required to move from the pathological to the ethical. Here we must resist the temptation of the standard image of Kantian ethics, according to which this ethics demands a perpetual purification from everything pathological, and an asymptotic approach to the ethical ideal. Even though this image is not without some support in Kant's texts, it is nevertheless misleading. First, because it invites a considerable simplification of the logic of Kant's argument. Second, because it obscures another very important line of argument, the claim that the Actus der Freiheit, the act of freedom, the genuine ethical act, is always subversive. It is never simply the result of an improvement or a reform. Thus, quote, if a man is to become not merely legally, but morally a good man, this cannot be brought about through gradual reformation, so long as the basis of the maxims remains impure, but must be effected through a revolution in the man's disposition. He can become a new man only by a kind of rebirth, as it were, through a new creation. End of quote. This passage from Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone is especially important for grasping the logic of Kantian ethics. Kant's distinction between philosophical ethics and the way in which moral questions are presented in religious doctrines is no doubt familiar. Less well recognized is the fact that he situates the appropriate change of disposition, Gesinnung, in a gesture of creation ex nihilo. The impact of this gesture escapes us entirely if we see it as a kind of retreat into the irrational, as a chimera of idealism. It is, on the contrary, a profoundly materialist gesture. As Jacques Lacan points out on several occasions, it is only the acceptance of a moment of ex nihilo creation that allows for an opening for a true theoretical materialism. Is not Lacan's own conception of the passage à l'acte itself founded on such a Kantian gesture? When Lacan states that suicide is the only successful act, the point is precisely this. After such an act, the subject will no longer be the same as before. She may be reborn, but only as a new subject. Thus, Kant concludes, if the expression higher faculty of desire is to be at all meaningful, it can be used only to indicate the fact that pure reason in itself is already practical. The higher faculty of desire, then, refers to the will of the subject as it is determined by pure desire, a desire which does not aim at any particular object, but rather at the very act of desiring. It refers to the faculty of desire as a priori. At this juncture, we meet the notorious Kantian conceptual pair, form-content, form-matter, or form-object. This coupling has often been attacked, and it has earned Kantian ethics the disapproving label of a mere formalism. The charge of formalism is usually leveled against the categorical imperative, insofar as it abstracts from the content of duty. But equally, Kant's formulation of the categorical imperative relies on yet another, even more fundamental distinction, a distinction between actions that are done only in accord with duty and actions that are done exclusively for the sake of duty. This, of course, is the famous distinction between the legality and the morality, or ethical character, of an action. Kant explains this distinction as follows. The mere conformity or non-conformity of an action with the law, irrespective of the incentive, triebfeder, to it, is called its legality, lawfulness. But that conformity in which the idea of duty arising from the law is also the incentive to the action is called its morality. We might say that the ethical dimension of an action is supernumerary to the conceptual pair legal-illegal. This in turn suggests a structural connection with the Lacanian notion of the real. As Alain Badiou has noted, Lacan conceives of the real in a way that removes it from the logic of the apparently mutually exclusive alternatives of the knowable and the unknowable. The unknowable is just a type of the knowable. It is the limit or the general cause of the knowable, whereas the real belongs to another register entirely. Analogously, for Kant, the illegal still falls within the category of legality. They both belong to the same register, that of things confirming or failing to confirm with duty. Ethics, to continue the analogy, escapes this register. Even though an ethical act will conform with duty, this by itself is not and cannot be what makes it ethical. So the ethical cannot be situated within the framework of the law and violations of the law. Again, in relation to legality, the ethical always presents as surplus or excess. The question then becomes, what exactly is the nature of this excess? The simple answer is that it has something to do with the Kantian conception of form. The exact meaning of this requires more careful consideration. Take, for example, the following perhaps absurd scenario. Person A is accused of committing a murder. Another person, B, knows, however, that the accused, A, could never have committed this crime. This is because B has been following his own wife, whom he has suspected of having an affair with A. It turns out that on the day of the murder, B saw his wife visit the soon-to-be accused A. Although she left A's house 1 hour before the murder was committed, B, the jealous husband, remained, continuing to spy on his rival in order to find out more about him. As B clearly saw, A never left his house. This witness, B, who has not yet come forward as a witness, has several different options. Option 1. He can say to himself, "What do I owe this cheat? Why should I help him? Not only has he been sleeping with my wife, but if I provide him with an alibi, my own embarrassing situation will become public. He deserves what he gets. He had it coming to him." So this option involves doing nothing. In Kant's terms, if B chooses this option, he acts pathologically. Option 2. He can say to himself, "I have a cunning plan. I will set aside my hatred for this bastard and testify in his favor. Considering the sacrifice that this requires, I give up a chance of getting even, my conjugal honor, etc. I will gain the reputation of being a noble person. I will win the respect of the community, and perhaps I will even win my wife back." This is also an example of a pathological action. Several other variations could be included in this category of actions which are legal in the Kantian sense, i.e. are in accord with duty, but not ethical. Duty is not the sole motive. For instance, B might happen to fear divine punishment for refusing to help another. Or he might identify himself with the victim by thinking, "What if I were in his place? I would certainly think that this punishment is excessive," and so on. Option 3. There is also, of course, a third possibility here. B can simply recognize that it is his duty to come forward, and do so for this reason. This does not, of course, prevent him from letting others know that A is a swine, and that he would very much like to break his neck, as long as he is aware that this has nothing to do with his present duty. In this case, his act is ethical, since he acts not only in accord with duty, but also exclusively because of, or for the sake of, duty. His will has thus been determined, assuming that another hidden motive is not discovered, which is always possible, solely by the form of the moral law. We can, in fact, call this position formalism, but only at the risk of missing what is really at stake. But then, what exactly is at stake? What is this pure form? First of all, it is clear that the form in question cannot be the form of the matter, simply because Kant situates the legal and the ethical in two different registers. Hence, matter and form, the legal and the ethical, are not two different aspects of one and the same thing. Despite this, several commentators have suggested the following solution to the Kantian problem of form. Every form has a content associated with it. We are always and only dealing with a form and a content. So, in this view, if we are to decide whether an act is ethical or not, we simply have to know which in fact determines our will. If it is the content, our actions are pathological. If it is the form, they are ethical. This, indeed, would rightly be called formalism. But it is not what Kant is aiming at with his use of the concept of pure form. First of all, we should immediately note that the label formalism is more appropriate for what Kant calls legality. In terms of legality, all that matters is whether or not an action conforms with duty. The content of such an action, the real motivation for this conformity, is ignored. It simply does not matter. But the ethical, unlike the legal, does in fact present a certain claim concerning the content of the will. Ethics demands not only that an action conform with duty, but also that this conformity be the only content or motive of that action. Thus, Kant's emphasis on form is in fact an attempt to disclose a possible drive for ethical action. Kant is saying that form has to come to occupy the position formerly occupied by matter, that form itself has to function as a drive. Form itself must be appropriated as a material surplus, in order for it to be capable of determining the will. Kant's point, I repeat, is not that all traces of materiality have to be purged from the determining ground of the moral will, but rather that the form of the moral law has itself to become material in order for it to function as a motive force of action. As a result of this, we can see that there are actually two different problems to be resolved, or mysteries to be cleared up, concerning the possibility of a pure ethical act. The first is the one we commonly associate with Kantian ethics. How is it possible to reduce or eliminate all the pathological motives or incentives of our actions? How can a subject disregard all self-interest, ignore the pleasure principle, all concerns with her own well-being and the well-being of those close to her? What kind of monstrous, inhuman subject does Kantian ethics presuppose? This line of questioning is related to the issue of the infinite purification of the subject's will, with its logic of no matter how far you've come, one more effort will always be required. The second question that must be dealt with concerns what we might call the ethical transubstantiation required by Kant's view. The question of the possibility of converting a mere form into a materially efficacious drive? This second question is, in my view, the more pressing of the two, because answering it would automatically provide an answer to the first question as well. So, how can something which is not in itself pathological, i.e., which has nothing to do with the representations of pleasure or pain, the usual mode of subjective causality, nevertheless become the cause or drive of a subject's actions? The question here is no longer that of a purification of motives and incentives. It is much more radical. How can form become matter? How can something which, in the subject's universe, does not qualify as a cause, suddenly become a cause? This is the real miracle involved in ethics. The crucial questions of Kantian ethics is thus not how can we eliminate all the pathological elements of the will so that only the pure form of duty remains, but rather, how can the pure form of duty itself function as a pathological element, that is, as an element capable of assuming the role of the driving force or incentive of our actions? If the latter were actually to take place, if the pure form of duty were actually to operate as a motive, incentive or drive for the subject, we would no longer need to worry about the problems of the purification of the will and the elimination of all pathological motives. This, however, seems to suggest that for such a subject, ethics simply becomes second nature, and thus ceases to be ethics altogether. If acting ethically is a matter of drive, if it is as effortless as that, if neither sacrifice, suffering, nor renunciation is required, then it also seems utterly lacking in merit and devoid of virtue. This, in fact, was Kant's contention. He called such a condition the holiness of the will, which he also thought was an unattainable ideal for human agents. It could equally be identified with utter banality, the banality of the radical good, to paraphrase Hannah Arendt's famous expression. Nevertheless, and it is one of the fundamental aims of this study to show this analysis moves too quickly, and therefore leaves something out. Our theoretical premise here is that it will actually be possible to found an ethics on the concept of the drive, without this ethics collapsing into either the holiness or the banality of human actions. Let us now return to the question of the nature of the excess which Kant recognizes in the ethical, and which he links to the notion of form. What exactly is this surplus that the ethical introduces in relation to the legal? In conformity with duty, the legal. In conformity with duty, and only because of duty, the ethical. By spelling things out in this way, we can see clearly that the ethical is, in fact, essentially a supplement. Let us then begin with the first level, the legal. The content of action, its matter, as well as the form of this content, are exhausted in the notion of in conformity with duty. As long as I do my duty, nothing remains to be said. The fact that the act that fulfills my duty may have been done exclusively for the sake of this duty would change nothing at this level of analysis. Such an act would be entirely indistinguishable from an act done simply in accord with duty, since the results would be exactly the same. The significance of acting exclusively for the sake of duty will be visible only on the second level of analysis, which we will simply call the level of form. Here we come across a form which is no longer the form of anything, of some content or other, yet it is not so much an empty form as a form outside content, a form that provides form only for itself. In other words, we are confronted here with a surplus which at the same time seems to be pure waste, something that serves absolutely no purpose. Lacanian psychoanalytic theory contains a notion that captures this Kantian conception of pure form very well, plus de jouir, or surplus enjoyment. In Lacan's algebraic rendering, another name for this surplus enjoyment is the objet petit a. With reference to the latter formulations, it can be shown that the Kantian concept of pure form and the Lacanian concept of the objet petit a are actually introduced to resolve very similar, if not identical, conceptual problems. The same conceptual necessity which drives Kant to distinguish between form as a form of something and pure form leads Lacan to distinguish between demand as the formulation of a need and desire, which has as its object the object Lacan designates by the letter A. What is at stake in both cases is the conceptualization of a certain surplus. In Kant's case, this surplus is evident in the formula not only in accord with duty, but also only for the sake of duty. In Lacan's case, desire is always directed at something other than, something more than, the object demanded. It may seem that there is still an obvious difference, and already on the terminological level at that, between these two conceptions of a volitional surplus. Kant articulates this surplus in terms of form, while Lacan, on the contrary, conceptualizes it in terms of the object. However, a closer examination of their texts reveals, on the one hand, an indelible trace of the object in Kant's conception of pure form, and, on the other, that Lacan's objet petit a owes to the notion of form. We began this study by introducing the concept of the triebfeder, drive or incentive, as one of the pivotal points of Kant's practical philosophy. This triebfeder is nothing but the object drive of the will. Now, even if Kant makes a point of stressing that the ethical act is distinguished by its lack of any triebfeder, he also introduces what he calls the echte triebfeder, the genuine drive of pure practical reason. This genuine object drive of the will is itself defined precisely in terms of pure form, as an absence of any triebfeder. We can see here as well that the Lacanian notion of the objet petit a is not far off. The objet petit a designates nothing but the absence, the lack of the object, the void around which desire turns. After a need is satisfied and the subject gets the demanded object, desire continues on its own. It is not extinguished by the satisfaction of need. The moment the subject attains the object she demands, the objet petit a appears, as a marker of that which the subject still has not got, or does not have. And this itself constitutes the echte object of desire. As for the relevant link between the objet petit a and the concept of form in Lacanian theory, we need simply point out that desire can be defined precisely as the pure form of demand, as that which remains of demand when all the particular objects or contents that may come to satisfy it are removed. Hence the objet petit a can be understood as a void that has acquired a form. In Lacan's words, object A is no being. Object A is the void presupposed by a demand. That's not it means that in the desire of every demand there is but the request for objet A. Thus we can see that the object drive involved in Kant's conceptualization of ethics is not just like any other pathological motivation, but neither is it simply the absence of all motives or incentives. The point, rather, is that this very absence must at a certain point begin to function as an incentive. It must attain a certain material weight and positivity, otherwise it will never be capable of exerting any influence whatsoever on human conduct. This conceptualization presents yet another interesting problem. According to Kant, the subject's separation from the pathological produces a certain remainder, and it is this remainder that constitutes the drive of the ethical subject. But this implies that it is the process of separation from the order of the pathological that produces the very thing which makes it possible. How can this be? How can something, the remainder, play the role of the driving force of the ethical if it is at the same time only the product of the ethical? How exactly are we to conceive of this temporal in-between that seems to define the domain of the ethical? We will see that answering this question provides the key to the critique of practical reason. But the matter will not stop there, since a whole series of structurally identical questions necessarily arise in the reading of the critique, as well as the grounding for the metaphysics of morals. How can freedom possibly serve as the grounding condition of freedom? How can autonomy be understood as the condition of autonomy? Kant's claim is that the practical legislation of reason requires a rule that presupposes itself. He also claims that freedom and unconditional practical law reciprocally imply each other. These claims, and the structure they indicate, cannot be elucidated unless we consider the standing of the subject of practical reason.